Today's presentation is by one of our research teams who's writing a chapter for this book. It's titled, Why Does Online Hate Speech Spread So Fast? The Psychological Perspective. The team is led by Maciej, Bieńkowski, Wiktor, Soral, and Michał, Bilewicz. They're all based at the University of Warsaw, and they work in this general field. Maciej will be our lead presenter today. He's a social psychologist and PhD candidate in psychology at the University of Warsaw. His main areas of research interest are social networks analysis, natural language processing, and how these technologies can be used to prevent the spread of hate speech, conspiracy theories, fake news, and prejudice. I'll also just briefly read the abstract for today before passing it on to Maciej. The internet and social media are often blamed for the spread of hate speech. Indeed, empirical evidence across countries supports this view. Individuals see hate speech more often online than in traditional media, such as TV, radio, or printed newspapers. Moreover, recent evidence suggests that digital users tend to accept hate speech to a high degree and be more prejudiced than traditional media users. In this presentation, the presenters will look at the social psychological perspective on why hate speech spreads so fast compared to offline channels of communication. They will explain the roles of three factors. First, they propose that hate speech is frequently fueled by the emotion of contempt, which has an empathy buffering function. Second, they suggest that frequent exposure to hate speech leads to desensitization to this form of language and increased prejudice. Third, they postulate that being embedded in only a slightly hateful environment may drastically change the perception of social norms and increase approval for hateful language. So with that, I will pass it on to Maciej. He'll present for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box as you're listening to the presentation. And after we get into the Q&A, you can either put it in the chat box or put your hand up to ask your question. Okay, so I'll pass it on to Maciej. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm happy so many people managed to actually come today. Please give me a second to switch to my presentation. For some reason, it just disappeared from the list of things I could share, which is really odd. Of course, I mean, there has to be a technical problem with online meetings. But Babak, we just had it, right? Didn't we?
Yes, we just had it.
It's really odd. Oh, come on, why? You know what? Just please have some patience, because when I'm opening this window where I can select what I'm showing, the window with presentation it's not there. But perhaps if I close it and open it again, then we should be fine. Otherwise, I'll just share the whole screen and then it should work just fine. Yes, there it is. Share. You should be able to see it right now.
Yep, it's there.
Perfect. So the epidemic model of hate speech and its perspectives. Today, I would like to start with reiterating the basic concepts of the model, which my colleagues proposed. And as we did describe this model in the chapter we wrote and in the previous presentation, I'll just try and really quickly reiterate the key points of the model, so we don't spend too much time on that. And I hope that today we'll be able to look at some directions where we are thinking about taking the model forward, and we can discuss it. And I would be really happy to hear some feedback from you. First, I will repeat the model, then we'll try and see what happens when we put the model to application in a almost real life environment. And then in the end, we will look at some problems we've encountered when we try to use the model to actually curb the spread of hate speech online. So an attempted intervention which failed. But first, let us look at the model, which was proposed by Michał and Wiktor. What is actually about? So this is, the model is a central theme of our chapter. In our chapter, we look at some data showing the prevalence of hate speech in general, and with special focus on online environments. Then we enumerate some factors which we believe are inhibiting people from using hate speech under what I would call normal circumstance, and among those, it's empathy or social norms. And then we, in the end, in the end, it's the main part of the chapter where we look at how exposure to hate speech, repeated exposure, and exposure in online environments actually gets in the way of those inhibiting factors. But let's start with the prevalence thing. So we notice several things. First of all, lots of people encounter hate speech. And in a couple of slides, I will show you a graph supporting the things I'm saying now. So yeah, a lot of people encounter hate speech in general. That's something we noticed. Then it's mostly online where they encounter it, and it's mostly young population who comes in contact with hate speech. And then there is a sad face here because it's not a good thing, because people are getting more and more often in contact with hate speech. And here we can see some more detailed data. It's from a representative survey which was conducted in 2017 in Poland. What is most interesting is this highlighted number here. Can you actually see my cursor when I move it around or not? I have to know if I should.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we see him move.
Okay, so I'm moving it around the number I want to attract your attention to right now. So according to this survey, in 2017, almost 96% of youths reported encountering hate speech on the internet. And by youths, I understand people between 16 and 18 years of age, and above, we call them adults. Of course, there are some methodological questions here, what people understand as hate speech, or whether a single encounter with hate speech is enough to prompt them to answer this question positively. But the general concept is that actually a lot of people do report seeing it. What is quite interesting is the contrast between the number of people who saw it on the internet and people who experienced or encountered it in other situations where you could actually expect it to be more prevalent, like demonstrations or sports events, or socializing also has high numbers, but still not as high as the internet. So from those data points, you can see it's really an online thing. And the answer to the explanation for this phenomenon proposed in the epidemic model is based on two aspects. And the first one is what happens when one is repeatedly exposed to hate speech against a given group. So according to the model, what happens is that your stereotype, your imagination, or how you imagine a group, it shifts. And because hate speech is a form of violence, so when you witness violence against the given group, and you see it repeatedly, publicly, and it goes unanswered, and due to the concept of, the content of the hate speech we read, we start to perceive those people, this group, as less competent and less warm. And such image will substitute the empathic reaction, which would be normal and expected reaction when you see someone suffering harm or just being insulted in public. So this empathic reaction will be substituted by contempt, which is due to the change in stereotype. So because one doesn't empathize but feels contempt towards those groups. They not only stop caring about them and feeling sorry for them, but they also want to get rid of them or have no contact with those people. And the other aspect of the model here, I can actually highlight it. The second aspect is the traits of specific to the online environment or interaction happening online, which actually enhance those effects I just mentioned. So there's a couple of those things that happen when we are online. And first of all, people interacting online experience lower levels of what is called social presence. And under social presence, we understand the feeling of actually being in there and actually interacting with other people. Online, it's lower than if we actually are in the same room as someone or meeting in other contexts. So as other research shows, that such a situation, the lower social presence situation, is in general bad for experiencing empathy or empathy working in general. And what is more, in the online environment context, we can be subjected to what is called information bubbles. And why they are important for our model is because if we are unlucky and our online neighborhood becomes infested with hate speech, we can get a false idea of this hate speech being a common phenomenon, socially accepted in general, because we build our norms or our imagination of what is allowed or not based on what's happening in our bubble. And therefore, the prescriptive norm, so our prior knowledge that uttering hate speech is something you shouldn't be doing, is substituted with this what's it called, like this the norm of you observe other people doing it, so you imagine it's all right and everyone is doing it, so why shouldn't I? So that was a really fast summary of the model. Two things happen when you are online and you keep continuously encountering hate speech, is that first of all, your brakes holding you back from using hate speech, they are released. And the motivation to use hate speech rises mostly, this rise is mostly due to the shift towards contempt, what we call a contemptuous stereotype. But okay, that's our model. And as I mentioned before, today I would like to focus on going forward and discussing some paths we could follow using this model to explain some things happening or try and actually use it to limit the spread of hate speech. And today I would like to address two questions. As you can see, those questions are very general because we're at the very early stage of this inquiry. So the questions are: where online? What traits of the online environment actually support the spread hate speech? Perhaps there are some online environments where the model simply won't work, some things won't happen. And the second question is, how much is this an organic phenomenon, the spread of hate speech online? To what extent it happens only because of the properties of the interaction people are having, and to what extent there is something more behind it. I am not going to come up with a conspiracy theory, don't worry. I know it may have sounded like that the way I just said it, but no. But let's start with the first question: where online? When we say online, as you could see in the data from our survey, people say they encounter hate speech online, on the internet. But in contemporary days, this is like a super broad thing to say, online. because we are meeting online now. We are in a meeting which happens online. So this is an online environment. And you could, I hope, assume that if someone started using hate speech now, that would not lead to all of us catching up with this kind of behavior. We have more traditional places like message boards, mailing lists, chats. Then we've got the communicators, which can have group communication going on, which makes it also an online or social media. Then we've got the traditional social media like Facebook or Twitter. And we've got the new generation. And then we've got those like really dark and scary and weird places like 4chan, 8chan, and other dark web things, which we don't really know so much about. And when you try and imagine each of those points I've just listed, you will have an image, you will have images that are very much different in terms of just how it looks, who will be there, what norms will prevail. Cognitive load will be different, right? Because in some places more will be happening at the same time and other places will be more calm. And what is most important for us is how connected people are while with each other, while using a given medium or particular online environment. And to take a closer look at this question of networking, we'll try, actually we did try, to put our model on a network. And what actually is a network? To answer that questions, we are going to take advantage of a mathematical tool, which is called the graph theory. And the graph theory, sorry? Was there someone asking a question? No. Okay. So this graph theory allows us to describe sets of objects and their relationships, starting from really super simple building blocks and then deriving very complicated properties of the whole network, of some subgroups in the network, and looking at properties of a single actor within the network, but only in terms of connectivity to other users. So this graph theory uses two concepts: edges, an edge, this arrow here, it's an edge, and nodes. So the circles are nodes. And they can be used to describe great many different things. It can describe flows of money between banks. It can describe like a relationship between kids in school, in a class, for example. So we can assume that this is A, and A likes B. I'm really bad at drawing using the touchpad, so I just go on and delete it because it's horrible. But you know what I mean, right? So very many different kinds of relationship, and we are actually going to use this graph theory to describe flow of information or flow of actually exposure. So here in this case, this arrow would mean that this guy I'm pointing at now, for example, he posts hate speech. So this guy sees it, and this one doesn't. And then we will try and see what happens when we try and emulate some actual real life networks of social media. But before we do that, let's have a closer look at the basic version of our model. What happens when we put it on a super simple network. So here we've got a graph built of nodes and edges, which represents a very simple social network. So the circle is a person and an edge or a line represents a connection. If two circles are connected with a line, that could mean that those two people are members of the same group on some social medium, or they are friends on Facebook, or perhaps it could mean something else. What is crucial here is that if two people are connected, that one of them sees what the other does. Yeah, they can see them posting on Facebook, for example. But before we run this simulation, before we see what happens in a more dynamic context, we have to add a little bit more information. So those colors here, they represent one of the components of our epidemic model, namely contempt. So it's contempt felt toward a certain given minority group. I'm not going to come up with an example, just contempt towards a minority group or an outgroup. And so green, like this dark green, is really low level of contempt. You could say no contempt. And red is like high levels of contempt. And in our model, it's a stochastic model. So the higher the contempt, it means that the higher the probability of uttering hate speech against a given group. 1 second, I have to switch a page, and I also have to switch a page here. And now what happens? Something happens. This guy in the middle, this one colored black, he just uttered hate speech. He wrote something contemptuous. He wrote something mean about the minority group. And because of that, his neighbors, you can see they changed their way they perceive this outgroup. So their color also changed. So this is the effect of just single expression of hate speech. Of course, it's a very strong simplification, because we do not expect that if you encounter someone saying hate speech once, then your level of contempt will drastically rise. The model assumes that exposure has to be repeated continuously and so on, but this is like, simulation is supposed to be simplified. So I believe this simplification is justified in this case. But then what happened? So like the general level of contempt within the network, and precisely with those two guys here, it rose. So the chance of them uttering hate speech also got higher. And in the next step, another chance to speak. Now those two guys utter hate speech. So like the first guy who did it does it again. And this guy who was orange before, he was not red, so his level of contempt was not so high, but still it was, I don't know, higher than none. So it happened. And in just 2 steps, we can see here that the level of contempt grew in the network like drastically. But let us now switch to a simulation. 1 moment, please. I see there are some questions in the chat.
Maciej, Victor's been answering.
So, sorry, but I can hear a couple of people speaking at the same time. I can make out what you're saying.
Maciej, I said that Victor's been answering them. Your co-author Victor's been answering them on the chat. So I think you can just keep going.
Oh, all right, perfect. So, hi, Victor. I'm glad you managed to come. And now I'm going to show actually Victor's work, dynamic model. So here we can see an example. Just 1 second, please. I have to find where I am. Okay, so let's see how it works in a bigger network. Okay, this simulation was prepared by Wiktor, and it's just supposed to visualize how hate speech would spread in an online environment. We've got a graph here showing, I don't know how many, but a lot of agents, and they are connected. They are connected in such a way that like each guy is connected to all his neighbors. It's not a real life network really, but it's supposed to visualize what happens on the network. I will start it now. As you can see, there is a couple of people. The size of dot is the contempt level, and the color is represents using hate speech. So if this dot turns black at this moment, this person now utters hate speech. And let's look at those dynamic graphs here a bit lower. We've got percent of hate on the whole network. So the initial number of haters is drawn from a random distribution. So it's nothing unusual that it jumps to a weird place and then gets more stabilized based on other parameters like the sensitivity and the contempt level in the network. But we can see as people keep using hate speech, the general percentage of haters on the network grows. the sensitivity, the average sensitivity of each agent drops, and this sensitivity, this parameter here represents the prescriptive norm blocking you from using hate speech, as well as empathy. And contempt, well, it represents contempt felt towards the given group, rises. And then here on the bottom, we can see a correlation between hate and contempt. And as we would expect, it's rising slowly. And this is due to the fact that, as I said in the beginning, those parameters are drawn from random distribution. So it's very much possible that you will have a person with high level of contempt and high level of sensitivity. And the probability of using hate speech is a function of those two parameters. So if your sensitivity is high, the probability of using hate speech drops. But as the agents or the people in the network, their sensitivity drops due to exposure on hate speech. And because of the same factor, their contempt rises, and therefore this initially random relationship between sensitivity and contempt diminishes. But basically we got to a point, it's really bad situation, because as you can see, like everyone is just uttering hate speech with some people randomly doing something else. But this is where our model, what our model predicts would happen if you just leave hate speech unchecked. But I'm gonna close this now and go back to the slideshow. It's still there. That's good. Okay. So using those two tools, like the network analysis or the graph theory and the epidemic model of hate speech, we can start answering the question whether every online social environment will be the same in terms of hate speech spread or fertility, if you can call it like this. What we would like to do, what we're trying to do, is to emulate network properties of different real life environments and see, simulate spread of the hate speech epidemic on those networks and see if it works the same in both cases. So basically we started from the premises that Twitter and Facebook, you build connections in a different way there. First of all, on Facebook, so on Twitter, it's really easy to build a relationship between two agents, right? So if I just write down all our names, and after our meeting today, I go to Twitter and I click a button, I'm following all of you, and then that's it, that's done. Like we have a connection. And on Facebook, it's a bit more difficult because you have to reply, you have to accept my friendship invitation. Some of you won't do that, some of you will not notice I invited you. So basically the threshold is higher. And where am I? Okay. And because of that, Facebook will be more clustered in terms of connections, because it will more likely represent the connections on Facebook will more likely represent real life connections. So if we know each other, we are members of the same class or work colleagues in real life, we will also connect on Facebook. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that people use those media for other purposes. So Twitter you use as source of information, and Facebook you will more probably use to keep contacts with people you know from elsewhere. And because of that, we believe that Facebook will have connections that are more evenly distributed. What does it mean, more evenly distributed? That means that if you take a given number of people on Facebook, they will most likely have lower variance between the number of friends each person has. And on Twitter, you have this more like power law distribution, or as I like to call it, a star system, where you have a couple of people who have lots of connections. So there are like popular journalists or politicians, etc. and a lot of people who have few connections. So it would be like regular people who just observe some others, and they are also not interconnected. So if I observe, for example, Babak, I don't know if you've got a Twitter account, but say I observe your account on Twitter, and so does Wiktor, that doesn't necessarily mean me and Wiktor are observing or following each other on Twitter. Okay, and so based on those assumptions, we generated two sets of 50 networks following those assumptions and representing one of them Twitter and one of them representing Facebook. And on each of those networks, we ran 50 simulations of hate speech epidemic based on the model I showed you just a moment before, this agent model. And we wanted to see whether there is a difference between those two in terms of how quickly the network will be, so to speak, saturated with hate speech. In our case, we assume the threshold of 50% people hating at a time. So if we get to the point where 50 people are using hate speech at a given moment, it means that it's really saturated with hate speech. And what happened? There was a significant difference in terms of speed. So lower number means lower number of steps it took to actually saturate the network with hate speech. And in this case, Twitter is, well, I don't know if I should use this word, but a winner. So in case of Twitter, the network got the median number of steps it took was 41 compared to 61, in case of Facebook. So this is one of the things we managed to kind of start looking into. We can assume at this moment that hate speech would spread faster on Twitter. But again, this simulation is like super simplified, and it would require taking some additional steps to enhance its environmental validity. For example, we could try and download like real data from both of those websites, or from Twitter and from Facebook, and then comparing them to our predictions of what the networks look like. It's a bit complicated because in case of Twitter, it's super easy to get data from Twitter. It like takes one day basically to get the permission and download huge amounts of data. In case of Facebook, it's super difficult. They're really protective about the data they've got, which from perspective of researchers is not really good, but from perspective of a user of Facebook, I'm really happy they are not giving those data away as easily as Twitter is. So before we get to the last part, which is much shorter than the one we just finished, perhaps it's a good moment if you want to ask some questions or have some comments you would like to say, or should we keep it for after?
Maybe if people have questions, they could put it in the chat for now, and then we can kind of continue with the presentation. It'll be good to try to wrap up in about 5 minutes, so we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Okay, let's go. Let's look at non-human agents now. It's a different phenomenon. We actually stumbled upon it by accident while working on something else. And it's going to be kind of a case study of the role of non-human agents on hate speech research. So a little background story. And according to our model, one of the things which happens when one is repeatedly exposed to hate speech is that their ability to emphasize with the targeted outgroup or minority diminishes. So we had the concept like, okay, perhaps then we should see what happens when we actually try to activate empathy in response to when people use hate speech. We came up with other interventions too. It was part of a bigger research project. So what we did, we found 200 people posting anti-Semitic content on Twitter, and to these things they wrote, we responded, among other things, using empathy to try and ask them to stop doing hate speech on Twitter. And after some time passed, we've collected data from those people again to see if the amount of anti-Semitism they produce dropped or not.
And what happened is that we were unable to see basically any difference in behavior. So there could be some sad explanations to why we got such a result. Perhaps our theoretical background was wrong and there is no reason why this manipulation should have worked. Perhaps we were bad at designing this intervention and we did some kind of error. We didn't like this explanation, so we put the research aside. And in the meantime, we read a little bit on bots. And as you can see, bots or like those non-human agents or computer programs or scripts which take part in online discussion instead of real humans are a huge problem online. And as you can see throughout different papers, the number 50%, you can find it there repeatedly, and people assume that around 50% of users of Twitter are bots. And we also did bots for our research with interventions, and it's like really super simple to build a Twitter bot. That's why people can use them, and they do. And what to do about it? Like there is this classic science fiction novel by Philip K. Dick. You probably heard about it. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, right? And they have this super sophisticated test for seeing if you're an android or a real human when they check your emotional response to some narrative. And if you fail the test, they shoot you on sight. Luckily, we didn't have to resort to such drastic and dramatic measures, thanks to Michael Kearney's sweet bot or not library for R. The name of the library is really good at conveying the purpose of the tool. So you can, if you have someone's Twitter username, you just put it in a function, and then using machine learning techniques, it tells you what probability is that a given person is a bot. So what I did first was I looked at my colleagues, my co-authors of this chapter, and the script returned 3% chance of being a bot for Michał and 9% chance of being a bot for Wiktor. Those are not really high numbers, because I then what I did next, I searched for some anti-Semitic hashtag and checked the first two people who wrote it. And the first person had 80% chance of being a bot, and the next guy called Unacceptable Fringed Richard had 61% chance of being a bot. But then with the data we've gathered with those 200, it's actually 198 accounts we wanted to manipulate into not using hate speech. We checked, and out of them, 125 were assessed to have above 70% chance of being bots. So this is like something you have to keep in mind while trying to make online interventions or doing any research on what people write online. And it's 39 past. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I was not going too fast in the last part. I got scared that there is not much time left. Here's my email address if you would like to contact me directly. But before we start writing emails, let's have a discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Maciej. And also Wiktor is here as well. So maybe now we can open it up to questions, and one of you or both of you can answer them. So are there some questions? I think there was one, but I think Wiktor's already answered it. So are there any new ones here? Let's see. And also feel free to put up your hand if you want to come on video and talk as well, if you prefer. I think Laura, you had a question, right? Do you want to ask it, Laura?
Sure. Hello. So thank you, first of all, for presenting this model. Whenever I hear about models like this, my mind always goes to response. And so I'm wondering, in light of everything that you presented, what this means for, or if you have any recommendations for responding to hate speech on these platforms, and also whether that would differ from platform to platform, given how the speech spreads on each.
That's super important and a great question, Laura. Thank you. I think that, okay, the first thing you've got to do is find out who's a bot or who you expect to be a bot, so you don't waste your time and resources on convincing bots to stop using hate speech. And the second thing is, I think it's actually all somewhere in the model. When we speak, for example, about the norms, we mean by the two kinds of norm, right? One is descriptive norm. So you see what people are doing, and that builds your imagination or representation of what is allowed or not. And the other is prescriptive norm. So you know beforehand that something is wrong or right. And what we assume in the model, what the model assumes happens is that when you come with a norm of I shouldn't use hate speech to an environment where everyone uses hate speech, then this norm substitutes the descriptive norm substitutes the prescriptive norm. So perhaps one of the ways you could do it would be to make the prescriptive norm more salient. To use more like specific example, perhaps on a message board, you should put ads saying, remember, do not use hate speech or insult anyone. But it's just something I'm guessing based on the model. It's not that we checked it to work. We tried to check if it works, but then we tried to convince bots, and it's a like futile effort.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we had a question. Could you please provide the details of your papers detailing these experiments and results? Many thanks.
These experiments, by these experiments, you mean the simulation or the bots? Okay, it doesn't matter which one you mean, because both were not published, because we are very early in the process of doing something. We are a bit further with the bots. We are trying to, like by bots, I mean our bots, the good bots, which respond to haters, convincing them not to do hate, because we are trying to do another attempt. This time, yeah, not convincing bots or hating bots, but it's still some time before that actually happens.
Thank you. The next question from Mara Christia. So interventions should focus on descriptive norms that discourage the use of hate speech?
They could. That's one of the paths you could follow. The others are you could focus on enhancing or activating empathy toward the group. Or you could try in this bot experiment with our interventions. Actually, the only intervention that was kind of promising was using Gordon Allport's contact hypothesis. So someone posts hate speech. It was anti-Semitic hate speech. So we use contact hypothesis. So to that we replied, my friend is a Jew, and what you are saying is not true. What you are saying about Jewish people is not true. And there was some kind of effect, but after dropping the bots, we had a really small sample, so it's nothing really, big.
Next question, Stephanie Ullman says, have you looked into bots that produce counter speech, for example, and how prevalent those are?
You mean not bots we made, but looked into bots that are already out there. Well, I think it's pity Michał is not here, because he was involved in a research on Reddit, I think, where a bot was doing exactly that. But I'm not familiar enough with this project to actually say more. Oh, exactly. Wiktor just posted the paper, where you can find more information about one example of those. But whether those are common, how many of those are out there, are they successful? I don't know.
I was going to ask a question as well. This book also tries to look at these questions in the context of conflict-fragile countries. What are your thoughts on application in that context versus your traditional context? I know we touched on a little bit on your paper, especially now what's happened obviously next door in Ukraine, with what you're observing.
It's a very difficult question, because as I think we mentioned in the chapter, We have no data to support the hypothesis that it is context dependent, the model is or is not. So perhaps there would be some historical factors or conflict factors. So it's different if people are just writing hate speech about each other on the internet, and if they are actually committing violence against each other at the same time. So it's a super interesting, very important path to follow and see how context dependent in general it is. But at this moment, I think we can only guess and make some very weak assumptions.
And also, this is also somewhat speculative, but of course, the big news the past few days has been the potential purchase of Twitter and the opening up of some of the norms, not so much norms, but rules around content moderation. Again, thinking about your research, if you were to, be asked to give a kind of op-ed opinion how that's going to affect Twitter, what are your thoughts based on again, all the research you've done in this area?
Again, it's just guessing at this moment, but the way I understand the new owner of Twitter speaks about freedom of speech, then I would expect those norms, the enforcing of those norms, which was there, right? Because if you wrote something really hateful, you could be kicked out of Twitter and your post could be deleted. So it did happen. And if it stops happening, I would expect, based on the model, that another break which stops you from using hate speech will be released. So I think the same thing as in the model will happen, just slightly faster, perhaps. It's not really optimistic what I'm saying, but again, it's like really guessing what would Elon do with his new toy. I don't know.
We had a question from Katerina. Please, Katerina, when you're ready. Yep.
Thanks. Sorry, the conversation now went somewhere else when you were talking about Elon Musk, and I was listening with great interest. I just wanted to go back to the beginning, if you don't mind, because you mentioned in the beginning, Maciej, that the definition of a hate speech is a sort of minor methodological issue, but I would say that it's quite fundamental. So I was wondering whether, after everything that you've discussed, which was very exciting, if you could just clarify in all your research, what was your definition of hate speech? So what was your starting point? Thanks.
Our starting point was that you cannot actually have a proper definition of hate speech, and there is a really long and interesting article by a guy called Brown, who is a philosopher of law, and he explains why it's actually impossible to come up with one definition. But another problem is that hate speech has been used as in political context to accuse political opponents of using it. So how it's used is very broad, but you don't really need this definition to go ahead, because sometimes without the definition, you see an example of hate speech and you know this is hate speech. So in our case, we, in those bot thing, we used anti-Semitic hate speech. And unfortunately, we found such examples that allowed us to not have a very proper definition and not have a very strict boundary for what is and what is not hate speech. I think, yes, Miara Christia just posted a link to this text by Brown. It's really long, and if you're not into philosophy of law, it might not be easy to read, but I think it's super interesting and informative.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Well, there's one more. Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think we can kind of.
Sorry, I think there's Jamie.
There's one more here. Okay. Sorry, did I miss one?
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for your insight on this. I think I heard when in the beginning that you were talking about like a desensitivity to hate speech from a content analyst point of view, someone who's reviewing a lot of hate speech. Do you find that the trends are following with people who analyze it versus people using it, or is it something that companies should consider only exposing a certain amount to content analysts for a certain amount of time before taking them out of viewing a lot of this to minimize this desensitivity factor to hate speech?
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, you mean, do we assume that those people who review it, if they are continuously exposed to hate speech, the threshold will get higher, so they will keep on allowing stuff which they wouldn't allow beforehand? Am I correct in general?
Yeah, I mean, well, not so much like not following policy, but just like is the desensitivity factor as prevalent with someone who is going to look for it and to analyze it versus someone who's using it?
Well, I would assume, I don't know the details of people who work in reviewing hate speech on those platforms, but I assume that what is necessary here is to having like really clear guidelines, which you do not have to refer to, you know, your guts or your feelings when you see something to know whether it is hate speech or not, because as in any profession where you encounter violence and other kinds of sensitive stuff, you will get desensitized at one point, which is also good because thanks to that, the emotional impact of on those people will be smaller in the longer term. I imagine it works similar to with, I don't know, paramedics, or you know what I mean?
Thank you very much.
I'll quickly move on from this slide as well because
Sorry,
the
I'm
last
not sure what that is.
made such a nice introduction. I'll just give a quick note here that both Sheila and I are connected with Ukraine. I'm Ukrainian American, and Sheila has worked with and in Ukraine for many years. So this is a personal time of turmoil in addition to professional. And I will be sharing some anecdotes and information that I wouldn't have done.
Okay, sorry about that. Please proceed. I think there was another question. There's a question about peace building, or bots for good. Have you had any exposure to that and whether it's effective or not?
It's a project, right?
I believe so, yes.
No, I don't think. Perhaps Wiktor, you heard about it? I mean, we should certainly look at that, but I don't think I've heard about it.
In general, pro-social bots, have you reviewed that literature and to what degree they're effective?
Except for the project which Wiktor mentioned before, the one, here it is, Bilewicz, Tremska, Leliwa, Dowgiało, and others, Artificial Intelligence Against Hate. I don't think so. And that intervention was built on some different assumptions. But I think it was also quite effective, but it was more focused on preventing people from aggression in general.
Other questions at all? Okay, well, I think we've had lots of really good discussion. Thank you very much, Maciej and Wiktor, on the chat for your answers and for sharing your research. Thanks everyone here for participating as well. I think those who've come to a number of these over the past few months have found, a whole rich variety of research taking place in this field. We're hoping, again, this book comes out in about a year from now. We're in the process of kind of putting it all together. And this was an opportunity just to share more widely some of the research that's going on. You could find videos to these. There's, again, the other presentations, if you happen to miss them, there's videos for them. So you can find them on the media and peace building. I'll actually just stick it in the chat as well before we end, in case you want to look at more videos from previous presentations as well. Let's get this in here. One sec. And this will also go up on video in a few days. Okay, so I think we can wrap up there. Again, thank you very much for your presentation today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.